Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to this World Affairs Council Washington, D.C. World Affairs Today program. Tonight, we turn to the subject of Syria. In March 2011, protests by Syrians against the arrest and torture of youths turned violent as security forces opened fire, killing protest participants. What began as civil protests escalated over weeks and months into acts of civil war, as the regime responded with greater violence to the perceived threat to its authority. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad is now characterized as a brutal dictator, a contrast to the moderate reformer he was hoped to be when he became president in 2000. Tonight's speaker, Dr. David Lesch, is the author of Syria, The Fall of the House of Assad. Dr. Lesch is consistently met with and advised high-level officials in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and the United Nations on diplomatic issues. He also met with President Bashar al-Assad on a regular basis between 2004 and 2009. He has testified in front of the Senate and House committees in Washington, D.C., and has been quoted in over 400 newspapers worldwide, and has been featured in articles and magazines in 20 countries. And he has appeared frequently on national and international television and radio programs, such as CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, PBS, NewsHour, NPR, and BBC. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Lesch.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Washington World Affairs Council for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak in front of such an erudite audience. I look forward to the Q&A afterward. I grew up in the Baltimore area. Somehow ended up in Texas at Trinity University in San Antonio. Don't ask me how, but I love it there. But I miss Baltimore, Washington area quite a bit, so it's always a pleasure to come back. There's a few of you here that may know my background just before I got into academia, and therefore you may understand that in many ways I prefer to talk about the chances of the Orioles and the Nationals meeting in the World Series than Syria. Certainly a much more pleasant topic than what I'm going to talk about tonight, and it isn't a pleasant topic. I've been traveling to Syria for over a quarter century on a regular basis. To see the country go through what it's been going through the last 18 months, to see it degraded in the way it has been degraded, I can't tell you how painful it is for me so far away, and much less, obviously, the people who are experiencing this on a daily basis. I've had friends on both sides of the conflict that have been killed. I have had many more friends whose lives have been forever disrupted. They've been displaced, and I just hope at some point that Syria will be put back together again and settle down. Unfortunately, I don't think that point is anytime soon, because the Syrian people are wonderful people. It's a beautiful country, and they deserve freedom, prosperity, and stability no less than anyone else. Now, at the beginning of 2011, when the Arab Spring was raging on in Tunisia, beginning to make itself felt in Egypt and elsewhere, things in Syria seemed to be pretty good. You know, Bashar al-Assad was featured in newspaper articles. Syria, in late 2010, Syria was hailed in some of the leading newspapers in terms of what it was doing in tourism and even a little bit on economic development. As some of you know, the First Lady of Syria, al-Assad, was featured in a now infamous Vogue article called Rose of the Desert. And you know, she was praised and hailed. So things seemed to be pretty good. You know, Bashar and Asma were in Paris, feted by the Parisian elite in late 2010. So I can almost guarantee that Assad was absolutely shocked in March when the Arab Spring seeped into Syria. He had commissioned, and not very many people know this, but he had commissioned 3 studies by various branches of the intelligence services in Syria to assess whether or not the Arab Spring would in fact enter Syria, and all 3 of them said no, they would not. So he felt pretty sure about himself. He thought he was safe and secure and popular in the country beyond condemnation, which may have contributed to his belief, as we all have understood and seen him say time and again since the uprising began, contributed to his belief that it could only happen via conspiracy orchestrated by Syria's external enemies, but not in the Middle East of 2011, where the stream of information via social media could not be controlled as it has been in the past. The perfect storm in the Arab world of higher commodity prices that made basic items much more expensive, a youth bulge that created a gap between mobilization. When I say that, mobilization, it means education, expectations, especially with free education in the university level and through the primary and secondary levels in most of these Arab countries that made this socialist compact ever since the late 50s, early 60s. The gap between that mobilization and actual assimilation, meaning jobs and making an adequate living. Even WikiLeaks, particularly in the Tunisian situation, revealed the luxurious lifestyles of the ruling elite and bared for all to see the widespread socioeconomic problems, corruption, and restricted political space. And in this, in many ways, Syria was no different. The number of people in the Syrian population of 22 million below the age of 25 is about 60%. And that's very consistent with other countries in the Middle East, in the Arab world. The unemployment rate, estimated about 20–25% countrywide, is even much higher among those under 25, at approximately 53% of females, 67% of males. The corruption perceptions index for 2010 and for every year before that, which measures transparency in terms of doing business and so forth, Syria is usually in the bottom quarter, as it was in 2010. And after the popular uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt led to the removal of the authoritarian regimes in each country, the barrier of fear, the repressive apparatus of the state had been broken across the Arab world and certainly in Syria. Assad, though, he thought Syria was indeed different. In fact, calls for similar protests, aping what happened in Tunisia and Egypt in early 2011, to be held in Syria in January and February in cities around Syria by anti-Assad elements in and outside the country, failed to produce much of a response. Rather than thousands, only dozens showed up, usually fizzling out shortly or being easily dispersed by security. There just didn't seem to be the same energy for opposition in Syria as there had been in other countries, which only made the regime obviously feel that much more secure. In January and February 2011, amid the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and Yemen, Assad portrayed his country as almost immune from such domestic unrest in a famous, now infamous interview he gave to Jay Solomon, the Wall Street Journal, in late January. The mouthpieces of the Syrian regime consistently echoed this view, even to the point of expressing support of the protesters in Egypt and Tunisia. It was pointed out that the septuagenarian and octogenarian leaders of those particular countries were out of touch with their populations. They were also corrupt lackeys of the United States and Israel. The implication, of course, was that Assad, a relatively young 45 years old at the time, was in touch with the Arab youth. He had also consistently confronted the United States and Israel in the region, supported the resistance forces of Hezbollah and Hamas, thus brandishing credentials that played very well on the Arab street. This may have bought us some time, but it was really a misreading of the situation or even a denial of it. Syria was suffering from many of the same socioeconomic underlying factors that existed in other Arab countries, particularly non-oil producing Arab countries, that created the well of disenfranchisement and disempowerment, especially among an energized and increasingly frustrated youth. But there were some differences that led a number of people, including myself at the time, before the uprising actually broke out, that thought that perhaps Syria would be one of the last ones hit, or that it may weather the storm of the Arab Spring altogether. I'm going to go through some of these reasons why that we thought at the time, because they're instructive on how the regime responded thereafter, because many of these very same reasons are in play today as they were just before the uprising began. One of these reasons is because of Syria's turbulent political history after independence in 1946. Syrians generally have had a disdain for engaging in activities that could produce instability and chaos. You only have to look across their borders on either side, to Lebanon and Iraq, two countries like Syria that are ethnically and religiously sectarian, to see how political disorder can violently rip apart the fabric of society, particularly if there is a weak central authority or if the central authority is precipitously removed, as is the case in Iraq after 2003. Of course, this trepidation was constantly stoked by the regime to reinforce the necessity of maintaining stability at all costs. It frequently portrays itself as the only thing standing between stability and chaos. As long as Assad remained the only viable alternative in the minds of many Syrians, they were not going to participate in an opposition movement that could destabilize the country. For the many Syrians who were ambivalent, the lack of support for the opposition was not necessarily a vote of confidence for the regime, but a recognition of the lack of a viable alternative. And if you look at it, I mean, I'm kind of stewing about in my head this theory, and I'm a liberal arts major historian, so math is not my primary subject, but I passed it by my wife, who is a math major, and she concurs. But you know, Syria is a country of 22 million people. I was just thinking about this the other day, and you know, so you're one of the first to hear it, and you're one of the first to hear it. So I'm sure you'll let me know if I'm off. You know, if you from everything I've seen, all the intelligence reports that have been declassified, or talking to people who are assessing the situation, there are maybe 50,000 active opposition fighters. I'll say 100,000, just to be, you know, a very generous figure. You figure there may be about 200,000 or so actively in the opposition who are supporting the rebels in terms of medical supplies, carrying things back and forth along supply lines, you know, stuff like that. So maybe about 300,000. And then I'll move it even up to 1 million with those who actively sympathize with the rebels. You look at the regime, maybe 300,000 forces they can really count on, and they move them about the country. Maybe 200,000, maybe I'll say 500,000 in bureaucracy and security services who are actively supporting the regime. Maybe another 1 million, you know, especially amongst the Alawite community, Christians in other words, who are actively supporting the regime, not just fence-sitting. And so I don't know what that adds up to, you know, maybe a couple of million people in a country of 22 million. So what are the other 20 million doing? Now you discount many of the children, of course, who are, you know, just trying to survive, and they don't have any political views either way. And you're still many, many millions of people. And they're just trying to survive in this. They haven't decided which way or another. Most, again, are just fence-sitting and waiting to see what happens. They don't see a viable alternative yet to the Bashar al-Assad regime, so they're not jumping ship. And again, it's not necessarily that they support the regime. But most of all, as I said earlier, they want stability and security. And that's one thing the Assads did, both father and son, House of Assad and Bashar al-Assad, for 40 years, was provide stability and security at a price of freedom and liberty and overwhelming and omnipresent security services, the mukhabarat. It's a mukhabarat state. It's a security state. But it's just interesting, you know, that you know, the stuff we see in the news and everything portrays this country as at war everywhere, and it is spread out, particularly in the countryside and getting into some of the major cities, certainly in Homs and increasingly in Aleppo and Damascus. But most of the people are not involved in this, certainly not materially or actively. And where they go may ultimately decide who wins this thing. In addition, getting back to the reasons why perhaps many of us thought that Syria would weather the storm, and also perhaps, again, reasons in play why the regime is still in power. The fate of the Syrian military and security services are closely tied to that of the regime. So unlike in Egypt, these institutions have not been prone to separation from the political apparatus. On the contrary, they aggressively led the violent crackdown against the protesters. Bashar al-Assad carefully maneuvered his most loyal allies into the military security apparatus over the years, as he has done in the government ministries, as he has done in the Ba'ath Party. This is his deal. I mean, these are his people. The old guard are gone from his father's day and have long been. And the regime was careful to use the most loyal divisions in the military, particularly those that are made up mostly of Alawites, to spearhead the crackdowns in the cities and towns that generated the most unrest. The minority elements of the regime and the population as a whole, particularly the Alawites, make up about 10–13% of the country, as well as Christians make up about 9–10% of the country, believe their fate rested with that of the regime. Therefore, they vigorously support the status quo. These elements in the military security apparatus will not be able to survive, they think, they would not be able to survive the fall of a regime largely intact, unlike what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. And the regime has been reinforcing these fears. In Syrian TV, Syrian newspapers, there are every day reports of atrocities against Alawites, atrocities against Christians carried out by the opposition. Rapes and murders. I heard one the other day, an Alawite being fed alive through a grinder, a meat grinder. You know, these are the stories that are being propagated. No doubt there are atrocities on both sides, but it reinforces this fear amongst the Alawites and Christians that if the regime is removed, as often happens in sectarian settings in the Middle East, those that come to power will take out their revenge and wipe out those who just were pushed out of power. And so, you know, you wonder why the Alawites are fighting so tenaciously. They're fighting in many ways for their survival. And in addition, the Alawites have been, oppressed minority for centuries in Syria. They waited a long time and worked very hard to work their way into power, and they're not going to give it up very, very easily. In addition, the historical memory of the Syrian military action ordered by House of Assad in 1982 in Hama against the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, killing at least 20,000 militants, according to most reports, certainly weighed heavily on the minds of the Syrians. With the brutality of the crackdown since March 2011, it appeared that the regime wanted to remind Syrians that it was willing to go to similar lengths as well to crush any resistance, and it had the necessary loyalty of the military party and government to do so. The repressive apparatus of the state, military, mukhabarat, paramilitary groups, the so-called shabiha, was daunting to anyone contemplating taking it on. On a related issue, I talked about the minority aspect. Now, Syria is a country that is 75% Sunni Muslim, 65% Sunni Arab Muslim. The remaining 10% are Sunni Kurds. The Assads have skillfully played the minority card over the years, practically guaranteeing for themselves about 20–30% loyal support base in the country while playing on minority fears, again, as I said earlier, the potential of a repressive Sunni Muslim rule and or instability in which minorities typically pay a high price. There are loyal Sunnis from the business class, part of the military mercantile complex that has existed and been built up, particularly by his father, Hafiz al-Assad, as well as Sufi Muslims, the mystical Islamic sect who are, it's not a sect, but mystical Islam, who are mostly Sunni in the country, who tend to have a more eclectic and tolerant view of other Muslim sects and non-Muslim religions, and they've been actively cultivated and supported by the Syrian government under the Assad, especially Bashar. So when you add up all these elements together, it probably is getting pretty close, here's my math again, but probably getting pretty close to about 50% of the country. And through coercion, a pervasive spying apparatus, carefully constructed tribal and family alliances, bribery, and our divide and rule tactics, the Assads, father and son, have maintained control for 4 decades and have helped them to remain in power now, and as I think has allowed them to think that they have perhaps more support than they do. Certainly they have more than most in the West think. Bashar al-Assad himself was generally well-liked in the country. And I know this from spending a lot of time in Syria everywhere in the country, among many different classes and sects and so forth. Or at least I should say he wasn't generally reviled. Most people did not like the Syrian regime. They didn't like the mukhabarat. They didn't like the Syrian authoritarian system. But they usually gave a pass to Bashar in many ways. Most did. Not everybody, but most did. They liked him, but not much of the apparatus. He lived and acted humbly, at least until some of the emails came out, perhaps, over the last 18 months, maybe revealing al-Assad's taste. But certainly the impression was that he lived, and I think he did, he lived in a very kind of middle-class, typical Damascene, upper-middle-class, typical Damascene home in Syria, in the Malki district. You won't find really any WikiLeaks reports from that time, at least, detailing an extravagant lifestyle, because he really didn't have one. There were stories constantly of Bashar and al-Assad driving their own car without bodyguards, something he can't do today, obviously, but driving around without bodyguards, driving his own car, in other words, and eat in restaurants, and there were pictures of him doing that. And they actually did that from time to time, to the point where it became urban legend, where practically every Syrian saw them at some point in a restaurant nearby. And this image, of course, was that he was a family man. They were normal people, not distanced from the masses, rather knowledgeable of and concerned about their problems because they were engaged in the public. And al-Assad did engage quite openly, which is very contrary to Syrian first ladies in the past. His supporters would talk about him in almost reverential terms, almost as if he was a prophet delivered to Syria to bring the country forward and claim its rightful place in the region. By becoming president, Bashar gained a good bit of credit in the eyes of the Syrian public for giving up his passion, ophthalmology. Remember, he was a licensed ophthalmologist. He was studying ophthalmology or advanced degree in ophthalmology in London at the Western Eye Hospital in 1994 when his older brother, Basil, was killed in a car accident, and he was generally assumed to be the next president, being groomed to be the next president. Bashar was brought back, and then he was elevated until he was able to take power in 2000 when his father died. Of course, you know, this was also promoted in regime propaganda, and in a way may have bought Bashar a long learning curve because he wasn't earmarked for the presidency, so to speak, and maybe more public patience with his incremental reform efforts for the very fact that he was not groomed from the beginning. His is the image of a good family man with a beautiful, cosmopolitan, civically active wife. Despite the vociferous pressures both inside and out of his country, he kept it together for a decade to a level of gratitude, I think, from the Syrian people, particularly when they saw what was happening in Iraq next door and what continuing instability at times in Lebanon. And through it all, there was some economic growth, even if it was very uneven. And this is one of the saddest things for me personally, having gotten to know him, I think, fairly well, is that he mortgaged all this away. He had this level of popularity, which I think he could have leveraged, in terms of making real reform, particularly early on in the uprising. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, there are very powerful entrenched interests that perhaps we'll get into. But that's obviously, his popularity is no longer at the level it was and never will be again. The Syrian opposition, again, more reasons why we thought this would not happen, and again, reasons why the regime perhaps is still in power. The Syrian opposition in and outside the country has been uncoordinated and divided without any generally recognized leadership. The Syrian regime had done a good job over the years making sure this was the case. There are many different fault lines that divide the Syrian opposition even to this day. The biggest perhaps is the fault line, the divide between the Syrian expat opposition outside the country and those Syrians inside the country who are opposing the regime and fighting and dying on the ground. There's a fault line between the more Islamist opposition, the more secular opposition, which is perhaps an increasing divide as time goes on. There's also a divide between the more militant opposition elements and still some elements in Syria who are calling for a negotiated solution to the crisis. Hopefully that soft landing everyone wants, that elusive soft landing. And therefore, it's just very, very difficult to congeal, and to create a coherent and coordinated policy against the regime. It has been in the past, and even more difficult under the pressure of a rebellion. And remember, insurgencies, by their very nature, are decentralized, and they almost have to be in order to survive. They don't want to, certainly in current circumstances, they don't want to have one center, certainly in Syria, that can be attacked and cut off like the head of a snake by the government. It's very easy for the regime, therefore, to paint the opposition inside and outside the country as the tool of the imperialists, because this sort of thing was commonplace in Syria during the first couple of decades of its independence. The Syrian regime understood as well that it had the support of some important allies in the region and in the international arena, most particularly, of course, Russia and Iran. So unlike Libya, which was isolated regionally and isolated internationally and in the UN Security Council, where Russia and China abstained in that important UN Security Council resolution that, quote unquote, authorized, that became the authorization by NATO and the US to support militarily the Libyan opposition, Syria does have some level of support. They have outlets of support. And this would play out, as we all know, to this day in terms of the uprising. And when I say to this day, I mean this very day, because the UN General Assembly meeting, the UN Security Council just briefed by the new UN Special Envoy, there are still major divisions at the international level and regional level with regard to Syria. And until that is resolved, in my view, I don't think there's going to be any assertive level or open level of outside intervention. Okay. Despite all these things, however, as I said earlier, Many of the underlying socioeconomic and political factors that lie at the root of the Arab uprisings elsewhere also exist in Syria. Unemployment, underemployment, poverty, massive corruption, and unequal distribution of wealth, which got worse in the 10 years, 11 years of Bashar al-Assad's rule. In addition, there's very little political space. Indeed, Syria has been a politically repressive state, as I've indicated so far. Not only is the system oppressive, the repressive activities of the mukhabarat are oftentimes quite arbitrary. Preemptive fear and intimidation are useful tools frequently employed by security agents as deterrent against potential unrest. A certain level of countrywide paranoia exists as a result, which the regime used to maintain control over the population. As one Syrian man bemoaned, quote, "The garbage collectors are intelligence agents. Sometimes we think even our wives are working with intelligence," unquote. The mukhabarat's accumulation of empowerment over the years, overseen if not sanctioned by the government, led to systemic recklessness that obviously backfired against the regime. After all, it was the hubris of the mukhabarat that lit the fire of the uprising in Syria when, as Stephanie was talking about, the children of Daraa were arrested and probably tortured. And that was what lit the fire of the uprising in Syria itself. And I've seen this phenomenon up close and personal a number of times in Syria, and I've talked to President Bashar al-Assad on a number of occasions. In one instance, I was traveling to see him, when was it, in November 2007. And I was traveling to see him. I mean, this was an arranged meeting. And I've been meeting with him on a regular basis since 2004, first to write to do research and interview him for a book I did in 2005 called The New Lion of Damascus that came out in 2005. And at his request, he wanted to continue to meet with me, because Syria was very isolated at the time, and I guess he just wanted some people to talk to, but I became something like an unofficial liaison between the United States and Syria when Syria was under a great deal of international pressure and even regional pressure. That ended by 2009. I haven't seen him since that time, although I've seen a number of other Syrian officials until late 2011. But on this one occasion, and usually when I came to the airport, a protocol officer would actually meet me on the tarmac, when I came off the plane, which was very cool. It was very nice. On occasion, sometimes, perhaps when Ahmadinejad was visiting or something like that, the protocol office would be occupied with someone else, and I'd have to go through customs. No big deal. That usually was fine. On this occasion, no one met me, and I said, okay, I'll go through customs. Usually doesn't take too long. When I got to the customs official, they confiscated my passport, and they said, "You're on the blacklist." And that's a list you don't want to be on in Syria, believe me. And I'm probably still on the blacklist. It's this black hole that, it's just impossible even for the president to get you off of. And so security agents took me to this rather small room. They put me in a small chair, or a chair that was barely off the ground. They were sitting on high ones around me, of course, and there was a table in front of me, and this colonel, the security officer, and there's a branch of the mukhabarat that just works the airport. And he was twirling, a gun in front of me, like Russian roulette, and which didn't bother me too much, because if you travel, those of you who travel to the Middle East, you're going to have guns pointed at you at some point, and usually it doesn't mean anything. Hopefully it doesn't mean anything, but usually they're trying to fleece you or something like that. But there was intimidation, and I kind of knew that. Still, it was uncomfortable. And they would ask me questions, and what am I doing here and all that. And I told them, I'm here to meet your president. And he didn't believe me. I finally convinced him that it would be worse for him if he didn't call the president's office, which I was beseeching him to do, than if he kicked me out of the country or something even worse. So he finally called the office of the president, and they confirmed that I had a meeting. And it was a nice moment to see him with his mouth wide open and go, "Oh my God," And he all of a sudden became my best friend. He asked for my autograph, and he didn't have anything to write on, so he gave me this piece of paper, which was the list of blacklisted people on which my name appeared, and so I autographed it for him, and he escorted me out, of course, and went to the hotel, and that was that. And I saw President Assad the next day, the next morning, and as he usually did, he asked, "How was your trip?" And I said, "Well, other than the 3-hour interrogation, it was fine." And his mouth opened up. He said, "Oh my God, what happened?" And this was a classic case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing in Syria, particularly the political leadership and the mukhabarat. They have this leeway and this independence to act in this fashion, and Bashar al-Assad allows that. And at the end of our, and we were discussing this, I mean, in his view, as he told me on other occasions and on this occasion, he says they do engage in excess. That's an understatement. But they do engage in excess. And he's very, he doesn't like that, and he's trying to curb those things. But in the end, he basically said it's a necessary evil in a dangerous neighborhood. And it is a dangerous neighborhood. But I told him at the end of our meeting, and in a very respectful way, and I said, Mr. President, if you don't get control of these guys, it will come back to haunt you. And this was back in 2007. And of course, that's exactly what happened. It's their hubris, as I said earlier, with the children of Daraa. Something like that was probably bound to happen. I mean, that stuff like that happens all the time. It's just in the new circumstances created by the Arab Spring, it burst out into an uprising. And the regime didn't realize that. And they weren't, and Bashar never cared to restrain these guys and get control of them, which may have been an impossible task. But again, he had that popularity, perhaps, where he could do that. I remember telling him in that meeting, I said, on the way back to San Antonio, I was going through Washington, I was giving testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on improving U.S.-Syrian relations. And I said, Mr. President, here I am, I'm going to speak to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'm an advocate for improving U.S.-Syrian relations at the time. And I said, what if these guys at the airport had roughed me up a little bit, which they do often to people? What if they incarcerated me or something like that? I probably wouldn't be in a very good mood. And in fact, I might say to Senator Kerry, who was chairing that meeting, nuke Damascus, instead of trying to improve relations. And that was, my point was that you got to get control of these guys. And obviously, that never happened. And again, Syrians face this sort of arbitrary repression on a daily basis, in many different ways and at many different levels. And it's an abdication of authority by the regime, by Bashar al-Assad, that's very, very dangerous. And of course, it did come back to haunt them. And particularly, Syrians just grew tired of the Mukhabarat state. They've been tired of it for a very, very long time. And again, when they saw the popular revolts in Tunisia and Egypt move against the security forces and the police and throw off the yoke of repression, they felt they could do it too. Why not in our country? Why not in our country? And back in the, no one knows what's going to happen with the repercussions of the Arab Spring. It may take a generation to play itself out. You talk to many Syrians today in the opposition, they'll say, if we had known that it was going to happen, that we were going to have 18 months of this, and probably many, many more, we never would have started this. But in the halcyon days of the early part of the uprising, with regimes falling quickly, they expected it to happen in Syria, and it didn't, for many of the reasons I just outlined on why we thought it wouldn't happen in Syria in the first place. Those are the very same reasons, in many ways, why the regime has been so resilient and committed to and willing to do what it takes to stay in power. And again, in the early part of the revolution, though, as one Syrian opposition figure, I think I have it quoted in the book, he said it was like making love. This is how wonderful it was to be able to oppose this regime that we've become frustrated with over years. And everything seemed possible at the time, or so it seemed. Now, Bashar, today is obviously depicted as the prototypical Middle East tyrant, a bloodthirsty killer. He unleashed the dogs on his own population, and at the end of the day reminded Syrians that he was more like his father than the reformer many hoped he would be when he assumed power in 2000, including me. Much of the disappointment in Bashar, particularly in the West, is based on what I call this conceptual gap between the Syrian leadership and much of the rest of the world. The first meeting I ever had with Bashar, after the pleasantries and after I explained what I was trying to do, I told him, Mr. President, one of the biggest mistakes you made early on when you came to power in 2000 was that you let it be known that you liked Phil Collins' music, the British rocker. And of course, he looked at me, and it was like, this is the guy we let in and giving access to. And I explained, I said, because it just fed into this emerging profile that because you spent 18 months in London, all of 18 months, because you're an ophthalmologist, because you weren't earmarked for the presidency, that you'd be this, and you have this beautiful cosmopolitan wife who had a job on, or earmarked for a job on Wall Street with a brokerage firm, and, is basically British, that he would be this modernizing pro-Western reformer. And of course, that I think was raised too high of expectations. When the expectations were so high, the disappointment is going to be that much more. And I think that's what happened to Bashar. I mean, he is a child of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's a child of the superpower Cold War. He's a child of the events and tumult in Lebanon over the years. And most of all, he's a child of House of Assad. Those are the formative aspects of his life. Those what formed his worldview. Not 18 months in London, the fact he likes Phil Collins music. He also likes the Electric Light Orchestra and a few other Western bands. When Assad spoke, therefore, in his first speech to the nation as a result of the uprising on March 30th, 2011, he branded terrorists, conspirators, and armed gangs as the primary reasons for the unrest. He still does. In every speech, practically, he has given, every interview. Most of those outside of Syria scoffed at such blatant misdirection from the real socioeconomic and political problems that brought the Arab Spring to Syria. But many Syrians, even Assad himself, readily believe this line. Their perception of the nature of threat is vastly different than what we see outside of Syria. Blame it on Syria paranoia bred by imperialist conspiracies of the past, Arab-Israeli conflict, and/or regime brainwashing to consecrate the necessity for the security state. But it is in large measure a function, as I said earlier, of living in a dangerous neighborhood, where real threats are indeed often around the corner. It is this conceptual gap, or perceptual gap, that is at the root of the impasse between much of what the international community demands of the Syrian regime and what Assad is actually doing or feels he should do to end the violence against the protesters and enact far-reaching reform. I'm also sure that if I had met Assad at any time during the uprising, he would point out to me that he has made extensive concessions and enacted dramatic reforms. He would complain, as he had done in the past, that he's not receiving adequate credit from the West. And as such, he would conclude, as he has done in the past, that the United States and the West have it out for him, that no matter what he does, it will not be enough. And I think he would sincerely believe this. And I also think he and some of his leading associates would believe that they really haven't unleashed the dogs yet. In fact, I know from a number of people secondhand that they believe they've actually been restrained so far. Again, a different conception of the world based on their own historical experiences. Assad is the product of an authoritarian system, one that is a paradigm of stagnation and control. The Syrian system is not geared to respond to people's demands, it controls people's demands. It's not geared to implement dramatic reform. It's constructed to maintain the status quo and survive. The reforms he has announced, they're seen as self-serving, after the fact, and insufficient. In any event, to reform more deeply and rapidly is contrary to the Syrian system, simply because it would spell the end of the regime itself. They are counterintuitive to the basic instincts of an authoritarian regime. Now, I got to know Bashar al-Assad fairly well, for someone outside of Syria. He never seemed to me like the type of eccentric ruler like a Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, and the people I know have met all three confirm that. They very much like him at a personal level. There are those who differ on this point. They see him as being this inherently evil dictator from the very beginning. Most of these people are those who have never been to Syria or certainly never met Assad. It's understandable, usually based on the prism of how they see Syria today. It's based on what has been done by the regime in the last 18 months or so. If they said that he would eventually succumb to an authoritarian system, even if he was well-intentioned at the beginning, then they would be correct. But Bashar was different than the typical Middle East dictator, which led many people, including me, to hope he might incrementally change the system. That Bashar was perceived by most who met him to be a relatively normal person, who then sanctioned a brutal crackdown of the uprising, perhaps says something about human behavior and how even so-called normal people succumb to the pressure of power and delusion. And I really do believe that somewhere along the road, Bashar lost his way. The arrogance of authoritarianism will do that. Power is an aphrodisiac. Either he convinced himself or was convinced by sycophants that the well-being of the country was synonymous with his well-being. And what he was doing in terms of violently putting down the protests and not meeting the demands of change was both necessary and correct. An alternate reality is usually constructed around these authoritarian leaders by those around them. And it's just human nature that if you're told you're a prophet every day to save the country, then you start to believe it. I really do believe that, at surviving the worst that the U.S. and the West had to throw at him between 2003 and 2006, and him emerging out of the cold to be accepted in the regional diplomacy and even international diplomacy by 2007 and 2008, that he developed this strong sense of triumphalism and survivalism and righteousness in his view. He thinks he's on the right side of history, and many of his supporters. And again, it's part of that conceptual gap. And his own experiences changing this person that, and I think I witnessed this change firsthand. I saw in him the fact that he was becoming much more comfortable with power, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you're in an authoritarian system and you're becoming much more comfortable with power, you're becoming a much more comfortable authoritarian leader. And unfortunately, this means that rather than changing the authoritarian system as many of us had hoped, the system changed him. In another sense, the Syrian government's crackdown is a push-button convulsive response to domestic threat. It's business as usual. It is not as though Assad does not control the security forces, as I mentioned earlier. It is that this is the way Syria works under the Assads. They reach into their historical pocket and pull out what's worked for them in the past, and what they found was much closer to Hama in 1982 than anything else. Except this time, it's what I call in the book a Machiavellian calibration of bloodletting, because any sort of 20,000 in a few days massacre such as Hama in 1982 might just compel the international community to act more assertively in terms of military intervention, and they don't want that. I mean, at least 20,000 have died over 18 months. In my view, Bashar giving this amount of leeway to the security forces to deal with threats has empowered them, and they only know one way to deal with these threats. Bashar simply went along with business as usual rather than understanding the different circumstances of the Arab Spring. In addition, under the regimes of Hafez and Bashar al-Assad, they don't make concessions from a perceived position of weakness. They will only make concessions from a perceived position of strength. So cracking down hard on the demonstrators while offering some level of reform are two sides of the same coin. This is the Syrian way under the Assads. Hafez al-Assad did his job well. He constructed an airtight but stultifying array of family, tribal, and sectarian-based patronage system and produced loyalty and stability, but little else. Ultimately, Bashar and his cohorts could not trust anyone else in Syria. He had little faith in anything or anyone other than his presidency that could lead the way forward. The Assad regime simply were not geared to implement change in anything close to an expedient or dramatic fashion, which is exactly what was needed at the beginning of the uprising. The Syrian leadership is also tremendously suspicious of the UN, the Arab League, any sort of organization that they see as a manifestation of its external enemies, including the United States, the West, and some of its allies in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And as I said earlier, he has confided to me on several occasions he really believes the United States and the West are out to get him one way or another. And so they must deal with the opposition ruthlessly, because they feel if they let up, then the possibility of safe havens can be constructed that will obviously be used against the regime in a more efficient way. Therefore, they must maintain unrelenting pressure on the opposition. So it's not a very pretty picture. This has become an existential conflict. It has become so militarized on each side. I was talking to some UN officials recently, and they were asking me about this, and I basically said, don't even try a diplomatic initiative right now. It's going to go nowhere. It's so militarized on each side. It's become so existential that nothing's going to work. You're going to have to wait till the situation changes for some reason that may create a more conducive environment for a diplomatic initiative. I see in the future that perhaps Syria, what will happen to Syria will be what happened in Lebanon to some degree. Different factions, the government controlling some areas and the rebels controlling other areas, and different outside parties influencing different rebel groups and the government itself. It is a situation that And unfortunately, I see only getting worse before it gets better. In that book, it was published in 2005, The New Line of Damascus, in I think the final page of the book, I say the following, and I ask the following question. Bashar cannot become a modern reincarnation of his father. If he does, he would indeed become the new line of Damascus. But this is exactly what Syria does not need. Will the shell of the dictatorship molded by his father, the repressive and controlling institutions of the state, transform Bashar into a reluctant dictator, or will Bashar, the president of Syria, eliminate the institutional basis of Syrian dictatorship? Well, I think we have the answer to that particular question. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
I'm reminded of the comment that Bertolt Brecht made after the uprising in Berlin in June 1953. He said the government has lost the confidence of the people. Maybe the government will dissolve it and replace it with another. So my question is, what do you see as the ultimate outcome? What would essentially make Assad a kind of Arab Ceausescu?
Unfortunately, I think the analogy to Romania and Ceausescu might be the way that this will happen if Assad should fall. Many people have been hoping that he would see the light and leave. There's some indication that he can't do that. There are those around him that just won't let him do that, even if he wants to do that, because he's the symbol and he is the power and he does have authority. But he's always had to manipulate, bargain, and negotiate power, because there are many other powerful fiefdoms in the country and factions in the government itself and in the military security apparatus. So I think he's in it till the end, whatever that end will be. Even if he is removed in an internal coup, there are very strong elements of military security apparatus that are Alawite-led and supported by a number of other minorities, as well as some Sunnis, that are not going to give up. They're going to fight. And some people think that, well, if the Russians and the Iranians all of a sudden turn and support, a UN Security Council resolution that may open the door for military intervention, that the regime will all of a sudden just give up enough. But that's not the case. They're going to fight to the bitter end. And I think they have this, when I talked earlier about this triumphalist attitude, they think they're going to win. And they might. They might. I don't think he's ever going to have the level of control that he enjoyed during his first 11 years in power. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. But they really think they're going to win, and they really believe what they're doing is right. And it's also survival. And there is an asymmetry of power. And one of the problems is, unfortunately right now, is that neither side has the ability to land a knockout punch. There's unless there's something injected into the equation that creates an imbalance of power, such as more assertive military support from the international community or even military intervention, which I don't see happening anytime soon. So I think this thing will continue in this sort of stalemated civil war, where you have, as I said, the Lebanonization of Syria, or the Iraqization of Syria. And unfortunately, since it's so geostrategically located, by its very nature, this is going to draw, as it already has, the interests of regional powers and international powers, which could complicate the situation enormously. I don't see an end game right now that's satisfactory to anybody. I just see this going on and on. And I think what many people are trying to do in the international community, certainly in the United States, is hoping to insulate this so that there is a Syrian solution to this. As in, most civil wars, unfortunately, you need a clear winner that imposes its vision. Of course, most people hope that that's the opposition and that their vision, which is not clearly articulated at all, and some people fear some of the vision of some of the opposition groups, but that there'll be some vision that will impose itself in the country that carries Syria forward and rebuilds, put this sectarian Humpty Dumpty back together again and integrate it into the regional international community. But that's a long time off.
I wonder if you could step back a second and tell us more about the Alawites. Who are they? Where did they come from? How did they manage to take power? Did the French after World War I pick them to run the country, or did they find some other way to get control?
Good question. And of course, the Alawites, as I said earlier, about 10, 13% of the country. The Alawites are most see them as a schism of Shiite Islam. They have a fairly esoteric belief that only certain initiates really understand. They're exceedingly secular in Syria. You can tell Alawite towns, they really don't even have the minarets and mosques. And the women do not go around wearing shadora or veils or anything like that. How they rose to power, and in fact, this is part of the problem. I mean, the most radical of Sunni Muslims, the so-called Salafists or jihadists, who are very much inspired by the 14th and early 15th century medieval Islamic philosopher Ibn Taymiyyah, who is the sort of the godfather of puritanical Sunni Islam, particularly Hanbali Islam practiced by the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. There's one brigade in Syria, and this, of course, raises all sorts of fears in the West and red flags in the West, called the Taymiyyah Brigade. There's another one called the Tawheed Division. Tawheed in Arabic, unification, and it's a term that particularly resonates and particularly popular with Salafists. And so the Alawites see these sorts of things, and it just feeds into the regime propaganda of their fear. Now, how they came to power is very, very interesting, and it goes back to what you were saying during the French Mandate in Syria between World War I and World War II. The French used divide and conquer tactics that they tried to employ in Morocco as well. They used minorities, just as the Assads used minorities to develop a base of power to control the rest of the country. The military, the Syrian military that they put together, most of the Sunni Arab population, certainly the ruling families, the landowning elite, the urban notables, as Philip Khoury used to call them, who wrote the classic book on Syria and the French Mandate. They looked with disdain on any sort of cooperation manifest in the joining the military for their sons, and so they did not allow them to join. Neither did they want to join. It was beneath them. So they usually bought their way out or just ignored it altogether. Well, the Syrian army had to be manned by somebody, and so the Alawites, who were repressed and very poor, mostly in the northwest section of the country, east of Latakia, they were most willing. Sure, we'll go in. I mean, it's a better life than what we have. It's an avenue for upward social mobility. So they manned, they gained a dominant position in the military, as well as Druze, which make up about 3% of the country. And after World War II, after independence, as happened in many countries, the military started to become an arbiter of power, because in an immature political entity with embryonic experience with democracy, a number of parties that came into being wanted to ally with the military because it would give them an edge over other parties. And the party that did this better than anyone else was the Ba'ath Party, that emerged in the 1950s and came to power in Syria in 1963. And so when they got the support of the military, and basically the Ba'ath Party and the military merged in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways, particularly under the leadership of Akram Harani, maybe the most influential politician in the mid-1950s, is from Hama, and he engineered this merger, so to speak. All of a sudden, guys like House of Assad, a young House of Assad and a young Salah Jadid, and who went to the Homs Military Academy and rose up in the ranks of the military, all of a sudden they were arbiters of power. And they formed the military committee of the Ba'ath Party that eventually outshone the civilian committee of the Ba'ath Party. And they worked their way up the apparatus, and from 1963 on, particularly after an intra-Ba'ath coup in 1966, Salah Jadid and Hafez al-Assad rose to the top, and Hafez al-Assad, another intra-Ba'ath coup in 1970, overthrew Salah Jadid, and there you have it. So a very backdoor way of getting into power, but that kind of reinforces what I said earlier in terms of they worked very hard to get here. They're not going to go back to the hills and the mountains and live a oppressed life where those that are espousing Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwa that to kill Alawites, or Nasseris as they were called way back when. He said that Alawites are worse than Christians and Jews. You know, they don't want, they do not want to live in that type of environment, and regime propaganda and some of what's happening with the Syrian opposition is reinforcing the fact that that may happen. And you know, maybe anticipating some questions, but you know, the Syrian opposition is increasingly becoming, you know, a little bit more Islamist than the West certainly would like to happen, especially with what we saw in Egypt and in Tunisia and even in Libya. There's a difference between Islamists and Salafists, or certainly al-Qaeda types. But as the situation devolves and becomes more chaotic, I mean, this is where al-Qaeda types cut their teeth. This is where they make their name, in places like Syria. And then you had the pipeline of jihadists that the Syrian government was looking the other way for, going into Iraq after 1963 to kill American and Allied troops with IEDs and so forth. They learned the landscape. They developed networks in Syria. Well, they're coming back. A lot of them Syrians, some Sunni Arab tribal members in Iraq who are afraid who want to overthrow a Shiite regime, what they see as a Shiite regime in Damascus. They want to overthrow a regime that's allied with the Shiite regime in Iraq, as well as Iran. That's where it could spread, you know, over the borders. And a lot of these, and again, you know, almost entirely the opposition now, and certainly all the leaders of the militias, almost all the leaders of the militias and other divisions and brigades in the opposition, they're all Sunni Arab. 99% of the meaningful, certainly, defections have been Sunni Arab. So this is really giving this a sectarian coloring. And most importantly now, these groups are following the money. You know, the money from the Arab Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. These are conservative Sunni Arab states. Islamic aid organizations in the Gulf, individuals in the Gulf countries. They're the ones that are really funding the opposition, where the money is getting to them. You know, some of the money from international aid organizations from other countries that's going through the SNC, the Syrian National Council, Free Syrian Army mechanism in Turkey, it's not getting to the front. You know, maybe $10 out of every $100. These other organizations and countries, $100 out of every $100 gets to the people on the front. And so if you're a brigade and you're fighting the regime and you need money, you know, $500 or $1,000 now for a grenade, you know, $5 for a bullet, you're going to all of a sudden call yourself the Tamiya Brigade. You're going to call yourself the Tawhid Division. You're going to espouse an Islamist verbiage and ideology and symbolism, because that's where the money's coming from. If you seem more like that, then you'll get support. Thanks. It was a long answer, but I'm an academic. We do that for a living. Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.